April, you have shared in your book, Star Spangled Jesus, which is an excellent book, also excellent book title, that you have a background in Christian nationalist circles in American Evangelicalism. Tell us about your upbringing and your background in this space.
Yeah. So I grew up a PK, as a preacher's kid. My grandfather was pastor of a large church in Dallas. It had like 4,000 members, and that was in the 80s and 90s. So that was
Ooh,
pre, satellite campuses being everywhere.
yeah.
Um, and then my dad was an evangelist and then also co-pastored that church with my grandfather. And so I was homeschooled. We would travel around in a motorhome all across America where my dad would preach. And then me, my two brothers, my mom, we'd sing before my dad would preach. It was like a whole family affair ministry. We
Wow.
also went all over the world. So I was in this ministry world born into it. This was my life. I never knew anything outside of American evangelicalism. That was everything. And so really after we were kind of more focused on, you know, global missions for the first I guess half of my childhood, and then really after 9/11, it kind of shifted to focusing on getting the country back on track
Mm.
because, you know, if you watched, I think it was the 700 Club, Pat Robertson was interviewing Jerry Falwell Jr. or Jerry Falwell Sr., and he had said something along the lines of, you could blame 9/11 on abortionists and gay people, and went down the list. He did apologize for that, but that rhetoric existed in the world because when you were raised in this, even if you're focusing on global missions, the nationalism is built in because you are taught that America was founded as a Christian nation and that God supernaturally blessed America through every single war we ever had. Like George Washington was kind of an honorary disciple, maybe the 13th disciple.
Hmm.
Um, and so you already have this built-in American exceptionalism within your faith ideology. And so you can't really look at American history objectively, because if you ever see Americans as being the bad guys, as, slaughtering indigenous people or owning people in the South with slavery, you then have to question God's goodness, because if God, blessed America and basically endorsed all of these things, then you can't ever see America as being bad. And so I was taught also that it was, white American Christians that pretty much were the abolitionists that got rid of slavery. I was never taught that the South used the Bible to justify owning Black people.
Hmm.
And, so from the get-go, you're just taught this very whitewashed version that is very patriotic and also very Christian nationalist, and God is very involved in how you view the country. And so when 9/11 happened, everyone was trying to figure out, how could God let this happen? And so we didn't look inwardly, like we were like, oh, it's the Democrats, it's the abortionists, it's the ACLU, it's homosexuals, it's feminist, it's all these other things that we're letting quote unquote sin into the country. And so my dad had wrote a book like 2004 that was called America Say Jesus. And on it, he put a prophetic warning that said, unless America defines her God, which is Jesus Christ, that God would lift the veil of protection on our country and that we would experience bloodshed like never before. And we went on a little America Say Jesus bus tour in a bus that had America Say Jesus all over it. My dad had an open letter to then President George W. Bush to try to get him to start saying Jesus and defining our God so that we could basically take America back for God. I wrote a song also called America Say Jesus,
Yeah.
very Christian nationalist. I sang it on the Jim Baker show. I even wrote a book when I was 19 called A Dying Breed, Is There Hope for the Next Generation? And I went against the ACLU and Christians who were too nice, that they were ruining this for all of us. So yeah, that's and then when became an adult and got a job, I got my master's at Pat Robertson's Regent University. I worked in corporate for a little bit, but then I ended up being a producer at the Christian Broadcasting Network and had some pieces there on the 700 Club. And so I was very in it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
All that to say. Yeah, it's funny because sometimes when I talk about Christian nationalism on my platform, I'll get a lot of comments from more conservative Christians that are just like, "Oh, so you don't know what you're talking about. You were never one of us. You were never
Yeah.
in it.
Right.
You're just a bad faith actor." And I'm like, "No, I've got a long list
Yeah.
of receipts."
I wrote the soundtrack.
Yeah.
Okay, so you're in it. You're writing books. You're railing against the left. You're writing songs and performing them on, I imagine, TBN with the Jim Bakker Show. So, at the time, how do you think you were perceiving the conflation of Americana with Christianity?
I thought I was just being a good Christian. Like I think that's one of the harder things about stopping Christian nationalism is because it hides in plain sight.
Yeah.
It's so deeply rooted in just everyday American evangelicalism that I think a lot of Christians here, especially white Christians, we have a lot of our faith has been co-opted by nationalism without
Mm-hmm.
our even knowing it because it's just in the soil. And so I literally just thought I was being a good Christian, love God, love people, exceptions apply,
Mm-hmm.
and vote Republican. When I was in high school, I made a MySpace group, dating myself a little bit, but it was called I'm a Christian, therefore I'm a Republican. Like my patriotism and my faith, my political ideology and my theology were so intertwined that you couldn't tell where one started and the other ended. Like they were one and the same. And so when I started questioning one part, it all started kind of unraveling because they were so intertwined.
Yeah. So like they're synced up, right?
Yeah.
Would this be a fair example? Like you're reading the Bible as evangelicals are often encouraged to do, and you're noticing all this immigrant talk, care for the immigrant, care for the stranger among you, and you start asking questions about caring for immigrants, and then maybe you get pushback. Was that in that? I mean, I'm in Phoenix, so we're always talking about immigration.
Yeah.
And I've noticed conversations about immigration tend to become spiritualized. Like building the wall or something is like Jericho had a wall, so we should have a wall.
Oh, yeah.
Right.
And
asking
they say
about
heaven has borders.
Yeah. Were you bumping into any of that kind of stuff, or what were some of the ways? Maybe help us discern from your experience. What are some of the ways that your politics was synced up with your faith at that time?
Sure. So I remember probably the first time I questioned like a big pillar of Republican Christianity was after Sandy Hook in 2012.
Yeah.
I was mortified, like, horrified by these elementary school kids that died in that school shooting, that were murdered. And it was the first time that I really kind of looked at my position on guns. And I was raised in Texas. We owned guns. Like everyone had a gun. That was also kind of part of being a Christian. And like the Second Amendment might as well have been part of John 3:16, But when I saw the faces, and granted too, like since my political ideology and my theology were so intertwined, the year prior to Sandy Hook, my dad died of cancer, and we were Pentecostal, and so I believed in faith healing, and that as long as you had enough faith, that God would answer your prayer. And so I just knew beyond a shadow of a doubt that God was going to heal my dad, and then He didn't. So I had kind of already opened the door to being wrong on other things, because I was like, okay, well, I know faith healing, that's not a sure thing, because I know I could not have had more faith. So I was already just kind of in this place of searching already, because my life had been completely stopped when my dad passed. So with Sandy Hook, I remember thinking, maybe we should talk about gun reform. The idea that maybe certain people shouldn't get deadly weapons that are meant to kill lots of people really quickly, like assault rifles or semi-assault rifles or whatever it is. It's like, that makes sense to me. Maybe we should have some barriers to owning deadly weapons. And so I remember looking around and seeing a lot of my fellow Christian Republicans, going back to the usual talking points of like, this is a slippery slope. Democrats are weaponizing the Sandy Hook shooting to take away your guns and then eventually take away your right to worship. Like it became a thing about Christian persecution of like the slippery slope. Once they take away your guns, and they're going to take away your right to worship. And I couldn't buy it that time. I was like, kids just were slaughtered. Elementary school kids. I think there's common ground here that we can actually have a conversation, because I actually listened. I allowed myself to actually listen to a Democrat perspective on guns for the first time. And I realized they don't want to take away all of our guns. They just want to make it harder for people to buy assault rifles or semi-automatic weapons. And that made sense to me. You don't need that kind of gun to go hunting. So that was it. But then I was constantly getting gaslit by everyone around me, because they're like, what are you talking about, April? Like, that's a slippery slope. Shut it down. But it stayed in the back of my head for a while. And so then there were several other things. Another thing, I was working at CBN when gay marriage was federally legalized. So I was in my cubicle when the news broke that the Supreme Court had ruled in favor of legalizing gay marriage. And I heard the wailing before I saw the news. I just heard like, oh no, Jesus, come quick. Like, someone was crying in the cubicles around me. And I was like, what is happening? Like, are we being attacked? And I pulled up CNN and I saw the headline. And I remember like feeling really weird, because I wasn't feeling the same despair that everyone around me was feeling. I pulled up the live feed and I saw a lot of gay people. They were so happy in front of Washington in the Capitol and at the mall. And I don't know. I felt out of place. It was like the first time I was like, why? And theologically, I still was not like affirming of gay marriage at that point either. But my heart was like, why am I trying to take away these people's rights when they believe something differently than me? And so that was like a first kind of, and also I had been sitting in those cubicles too. That was during Trump first coming onto the scene and running in the primary. And I was a notorious never Trumper, because I thought it was all a joke from the beginning. I was like, there's no way. He said he'd never would ask God for forgiveness. Like, I was like, that's it. That's it. He's lost the Christians. Come on, guys. And then they were like, oh, he didn't mean it. Or he's just a baby Christian. And I was
Right.
that honestly was probably the biggest thing, because I remember I was a kid.
Yeah.
But I remember when Bill Clinton had his little scandal, and my dad and all the Christian leaders around me were like, character matters. If he would lie to his wife, what would he do to the American people?
Yeah,
And like, they instilled in me that character matters. And when you're voting for a president, you want to make sure that they are a family man and that they are righteous and that they have good morals. And suddenly that just didn't matter anymore. They were making excuse after excuse after excuse. And we don't have to go into Trump. I think we have, I feel like we know at this point. And then it just continually got worse. The Access Hollywood tape.
Yeah.
And, when he won, which I did not vote for him, but I also didn't vote for Hillary, because I still in my head was like, I can't vote for a Democrat because of baby murder, because that was all I had ever been taught about what like reproductive health is. But I thought it was kind of just a glitch in the matrix, right? Like, it's okay. Like, this was just a fluke. This will go away. There just wasn't a better choice, even though there was. And so then over the next 4 years, I kind of just went really introspective of figuring out, like, what is happening? Like, what is actually happening in the church? And I was still going to my white evangelical church every single Sunday. I was on the worship team, and I had my oldest daughter. I became a mom in 2016, and so I was a lot of things were new, and I was seeing things in kind of this new light, and I found myself just getting angrier going to church because I was praising Jesus and I was reading the red letters and the gospel, and Jesus to me was someone who always stood up with the oppressed and the marginalized and was just kind, and the only time we see Jesus get mad was against religious leaders. But I was sitting in these pews in these church services worshiping the same Jesus as people who were posting the most hateful stuff on
Mhm.
Facebook during the week that I
Mhm.
saw. And I was having the hardest time reconciling, how are we worshiping the same God?
Mhm.
Like, we are coming away with two completely different ideas of who Jesus is. And it was getting harder and harder for me to stay in that place because I felt like I was, like, not being true to my integrity by, like, me being beside them, the people that were Trump prophets, that believed Trump was God's chosen, that thought Trump was the best thing for Christians since Jesus, whatever the case. Um, I was just like, I feel like I am being complicit by being here. Um, and I didn't know how to reconcile it, because if I spoke it out loud, I was told I was the crazy one. "Oh, you just don't understand." Someone told me, like, in 2020, if I didn't vote for Trump, I was thwarting the will of God.
Mhm.
And I'm like, I don't feel that way. Like,
Yeah.
I feel like if I vote for Trump, I am actually, like, thwarting the goodness in me, that, like,
Mm.
and completely shunning whatever Holy Spirit voice I still have.
Mm.
So, yeah, that I don't know if that answers your question. I mean, there
Yeah,
was a
for
million
sure.
other little things too, but
Yeah, I love what you're helping us see, which is that those who are imbibing American Christian nationalism, many of them are doing so in earnest. It's
yeah,
part of the ongoing discipleship that they're receiving. Moreover, is exactly what you're saying. They're disincentivized to ask critical questions. So you ask the wrong question, you get threatened with exclusion from the communion.
mhm,
We don't talk like that around here. We don't ask those kinds of questions around here. Only the woke ask those kinds of questions. Demonic people ask those kinds. These statements that are very common at the church potluck or the Sunday school class or wherever, small group. Um, it it creates this cultural boundary where we can't talk like that around here, which is not
yeah,
true belonging, right? Like, true belonging is to be able to ask whatever question I want without fear of expulsion from the communion. So you're raised in this, you're discipled into it. I think, is it fair to say, enculturated into this way of being, and you
yeah,
start noticing some of the holes inside, feeling like the thing that just got said from the stage or from the community, I don't agree with that. Also, maybe just noticing the absurdity of statements like "you're thwarting God's will" or God's
right,
plan,
yeah,
as if we had that level of power.
mhm,
Uh, what was the process of disentangling from that community? What was that like for you?
yeah. It was really hard, and it was terrifying. I mean, we only stopped going to church every Sunday in the pandemic because we were forced to be home because
Yeah.
a global pandemic. Um, and I mean, we still live streamed it for a while, but I found myself having more peace the further I got away from it. Like, going to those churches was becoming a barrier to my relationship with God, because I
Hmm.
was finding myself, I was just having a really hard time. I was like, "God, everything I know about you and what I feel towards you my own whole life is not what these people are saying about you." And it took me a few years to to disentangle, because initially I was like, they are crazy. They've lost the plots. It was very like I was separating myself from them. And then I had this epiphany when I was watching January 6th of 2021.
Mm.
And in the aftermath, you see all the Jesus flags, the repent signs. People were praying and worshiping while storming the Capitol. And in the aftermath, they started showing some of the people that were arrested. And two of them, one I knew from my dad's church in Dallas, like one of the more notorious ones. And then Beecher, my spouse, went to youth group with Zip Tie Guy.
Yeah.
And so then I kind of had this connection. It was like, oh my gosh, if you are in a red state and you go to church, you are more likely to be at the Capitol on January 6th. And then it hit me almost instantly of like, these are not those people. These were my people. And I was like, I was a freaking Christian nationalist the whole time.
Wow.
And that was when I really started to make some change, because I was like, I've been part of the problem. I was also pushing a lot of this rhetoric, thinking that I was doing the right thing, thinking that I was just being a good Christian. And so then it kind of clicked where, one, it took me a while to repent for the harm I had been causing, by equating, you know, loving Jesus and loving my neighbor with political power.
Mm-hmm.
And then also somehow having more empathy for people that were still in it, because I knew like they were using Trump, but I used George W. And it was, I mean, yeah, Trump was just more obvious. He was more obviously hypocritical. But then I was like, oh my gosh, this has been going on for a really, really long time.
Hmm. So you're having this realization. By the way, the QAnon shaman, Jake Chansley, he was processed a mile from where I'm currently sitting at the Arizona FBI building.
Oh, wow.
And then when he got let out, there's a church down the street that did a welcome home party for him.
Oh,
So
I'm sure. Of course they did.
so it's quite striking when what you see on TV in DC makes its way into your neighborhood. So you're witnessing people that it's a smelling salt kind of moment where it's like, oh my gosh, I'm realizing now how deep I was in, how bad it was. As you're having this realization, what are some of the concerns that are going on within you as you're maybe having this awakening or repentance moment? As that's happening, what are some of the concerns going on in your heart?
One, I'm like, what do I do from here?
Mm-hmm.
Like so many of my family, my extended family, my community was all wrapped up in this. Beecher was working at a conservative Christian college at the time. Like our livelihood was built into this ideology. And I was like, I'm not on board with this. And I was also like, really, no one wants to admit that they were the bad guy, and it was kind of me having to reconcile of like, oh my gosh, not only is this movement the antithesis of the teachings of Jesus, but I pushed this too. And so, Beecher and I were like, okay, we got to figure out what we're going to do. Like, are we still going to church? What church are we going to? Are we like, what are we doing? And it was like, it was kind of a day by day situation. I started, 2020 was when I first downloaded TikTok and started making some funny videos about Christian nationalism. Which is, Christian nationalism is not funny, but it is kind of funny because it's when you're able to be like step outside, it's so hypocritical. Like it's the talking points are funny because they don't actually make a lot of sense. It's easy to poke holes at it. And so I just started speaking my mind out loud. And family kind of disowned us.
Mm.
My mom, so when my dad had a few months before my dad had passed, she a family pastor friend who had lots of satellite churches all over, basically came in and bought the church from my dad while my dad had cancer. And like part of it was like, because he was wanting to start a church where we were living at the time. So like it was perfect. We'll take the building and all that. And part of the deal was that they'd pay a certain amount to my dad for the rest of his life. And then if he died, that would go to my mom. So this was like a financial, like this was really helpful for our family because we believed that my dad was going to die, but it was nice just to have that my mom had some
Sure.
security lined up because if my dad died, so did the ministry,
Yeah.
and like
Yeah.
their whole livelihood. And so my dad did die. And then that money, and it wasn't like a ton, but it was enough for her to live off of, went to my mom. And then this pastor, over the Trump years, got sucked into a lot of QAnon conspiracies and would start sending my mom a lot of really just out there thoughts, was very pro-Trump, one of the Trump prophets. Um, and so when I started speaking out, it became a problem. And he really wanted to like talk to me and make sure that our whole family was voting for Trump in 2020. And I was like, there's no way. I'm not doing that. And at that point, my mom, she had voted for Trump in 2016 because everyone, that was the Republican, that was what you were supposed to do. But in 2020, she was like, I cannot vote for that man. Like her, like she was recognizing a lot of things too. And obviously we talk a lot. But this pastor texted her on the day of the election and asked my mom who she voted for.
Wow.
And my mom is like the kindest soul you've ever met. And so she wrote this long, really sweet message of like, and she didn't even vote for Joe Biden. I think she wrote in like John Kasich or something, but she voted for like some local conservatives. And so she tells him all of this. And then he instantly was like, okay, well, we need to discuss your financial support. And my mom was like, he was like, can you call me? And so there was like a contract in place. And so my mom had been advised, like, if there's ever discussion around this contract, because we were kind of seeing, we thought this might be coming.
Yeah.
So her lawyer was like, get everything in writing. And so my mom was like, well, can you just email me? So anyway, so then he says, we need to stop financially supporting you. Because like in his mind, it was good versus evil.
Yeah.
Even though my mom didn't choose a side, by her not voting for Trump, she had chosen evil.
Yeah.
And obviously he never outright said that was the reason, but it was pretty obvious that was the reason.
So,
which was just like, so like a pastor.
Yeah.
Went like, because someone wouldn't vote for Donald Trump, a serial adulterer who's never asked God for forgiveness, who's bragged about assaulting women. And that was before he was a literal criminal too.
Mm-hmm.
But a pastor decided to take money away from a widow who's one of the categories that Jesus says we should be taking care of.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
April, I'm coming to the realization that maybe Christian nationalism is not a good thing.
Yes, correct. I think that's
right.
And
that it might have a corrupting influence on the church.
Yeah.
Oh, man. Yeah, I'm so sorry that happened.
I know it was very angering in the moment, but also really, in some ways, a blessing. Not that I'm tired of blessings in disguise, right?
Yeah.
But it was just a very, it was one of those moments where it just reaffirmed, like, okay,
yeah,
we're doing the right thing. Like, we're on the right side of this.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a, I get what you're saying about the blessing in disguise thing. They're going to the doctor and the doctor saying, hey, this unease you've been feeling, it's actually this sickness that, when you get the diagnosis, it's really painful and it sucks, but it is a gift because now you can get to a prognosis. You can get to, what are we going to do about it?
Yeah.
I think I grew up similarly to you in evangelicalism, and a lot of my experience was a conflation of conservatism and evangelicalism, but also hypocrisy.
Mm-hmm.
And I think complete lack of nuance or compassion or willingness to, invite everybody in.
Yeah.
And then you see the way of Jesus and you're like, something is not right. I mean, I was
Right.
very turned off by church in junior high, gave it up because I just had this sense of like, these things are not integrated. And I don't think I ever would have, of course, had a name for it. But in later life, you look back, you're like, oh, I see what's going on. It's become so bold right now, right? A
Yeah.
pastor taking money from a widow because of how the widow voted or failed to vote for the Lord's anointed. Like, it's so bold and in your face.
Yeah.
That those of us, I think, who can see it are like, well, all right, that's a sickness, like in evangelicalism. Yeah. But now we can do something about it. So I want to shift to thinking about, for many of us that are listening, we've grown up in similar spaces that you've grown up in. We have many family members, friends, loved ones, coworkers, fellow students who are totally in on this thing. They've doubled down, some of them over the last few months with the recent election. And we're praying through and thinking through, Lord, what do we do with Uncle Jimmy, Cousin Steve, my daughter Nancy, whatever it is? How would you coach us in approaching those who are embracing American Christian nationalism today?
Yeah. Great question. And obviously it depends on the person. But I mean, one reason I wrote my book, Star Spangled Jesus, which is my story of kind of the things that helped me wake up and change. But then I also talk about like things to look for that are overtly Christian nationalist, and then the scriptures, like the teachings of Jesus that are the opposite of that. I think the way to change, because the things that helped me change were asking questions, like in good faith, and to appeal to people's goodness. Because I think it's really easy to slip into an us versus them, even on this side. Because there's people that are actively taking rights away that, if Trump does start deporting every undocumented person, he's going to be ripping families apart. There's a lot, and I just hope, and I know that this is not the case for everybody that is in this movement, especially people that are making money off of Christian nationalism and that are gaining political power. Like, I'm not talking about them, but I think your everyday, average, church-going Christian who may have some nationalism in their faith, they mean well. Like, they have good intentions. They think they're doing the right thing. They think they're doing the godly thing because their pastor's telling them that. I mean, how many pastors did we hear in the last several months leading up to this election telling their congregations to vote, quote, biblical values, and then just name every single Republican issue as that biblical value, including owning guns because of Christian persecution that does not exist in this country. We've when we are held accountable, we frame that as persecution, and it's like, we use that verse, oh, well, they hate us like they hated Jesus. Like, no, they hate you because you're not a nice person. Like, you're being a jerk. Like, that's why. But anyway, the point is, I think we need to appeal to people's goodness, because when you are in this world, and it was the case when I was in it too, I only ever heard right-wing talking points. Because if I ever heard a Democrat or any even just a moderate, it was slippery slope. They're being led by Satan. It was instantly demonized. Everyone was othered.
Yeah.
And so it's really easy to kind of dig your heels in the sand, or even stick your head in the sand and just ignore it. And because it takes a lot of cognitive dissonance to hold a Christian nationalist ideology. It's like, especially if you are actually trying to follow Jesus. You cannot follow Jesus well and be a Christian nationalist. Like, the ideologies are in conflict. So I think we can appeal to people's goodness and find common ground, find where we share values. Like, for instance, the issue of abortion. That is a lot of people are single issue voters and will only vote basically on that issue. And you say, I've like, hey, I want to lower the abortion rate too. Like I don't like how high abortions are. I was like, what would you say though? Like how can we lower abortions while also protecting moms? Because in these current abortion bans, there are pregnant mothers who a lot of these women want their babies who are now bleeding out. Some have died. Some are not getting the care. Some are now unable to have children again because doctors are refusing to give them care because of very strict abortion laws. Would you agree that those are maybe a little extreme? Like, how would you solve that problem? If we are
Mm-hmm.
pro-life, how do we save the mothers' lives? And getting them to answer these questions, and saying like, hey, don't you think someone who has been diagnosed with a mental illness, don't you think it should be a little harder for them to get a gun? You know? I think most people would say yeah, I would agree with that.
Mm-hmm.
Or if someone was on a no-fly list, do you think it should be hard for them to get a gun? Yeah, I think finding common ground because I think we
Mm-hmm.
actually I think there's a lot more common ground than we realize, and I also know it takes labor to have these conversations with certain people who are so deep in it. Um, but I just think, especially if you're wanting to follow Jesus, you can only say kick them out so long before you realize, like, well, Jesus said to welcome the foreigner.
Yeah.
Like I mean, for good news though, I've had a few people say that, like my book, because I tell it from like my perspective to try to like hold up a mirror to say like, hey, I know you're not a bad person because I believed I was a good person when I believed everything that you believe. And it's like holding up a mirror, like it's okay to change. It's okay to admit that you were wrong. And if anything, like it takes real courage to do that.
Mm-hmm.
And like to give people a soft landing when they do change, when they do start to question, and not to be like, I told you so.
Yeah.
Like, look at the harm you did. Like
Mm-hmm.
that doesn't, no one ever changes for that. Oh, but what I was going to say is I've had 3 people tell me that they gave my book, which granted they'd have to read it, but they gave my book to a Republican husband and 2 like really Christian nationalist moms of theirs. And they actually read my book, and I don't know how much they changed, but I do know that they decided not to vote for Trump this round. So I do think there's hope. I think if we can like appeal to the goodness in people, once you can convince someone that what they are doing is causing harm and that person wants to be good, then
Mm-hmm.
they have to change.
Hmm. Yeah, I love that posture towards those who are in the process of changing.
Yeah.
Compassionate, gracious, safe space, soft place for them to land. I think about the Apostle Paul in the book of Acts. He's angry, ragey, persecuting Christians. Jesus does a work in his life, but then he sends this dude, Ananias, and Ananias is like, wait a minute, this guy's a horrible man. And Ananias is invited to show compassion to Paul, which is a huge like weight, right? Why? How can I show compassion to a person who thinks this way or believe this way or did these things?
Yeah.
And yet, in my experience, what often keeps people in the warm embrace of American Christian nationalism is they're not experiencing compassionate community outside of that. So even the pale facsimile of community in American Christian nationalist circles, as tostic and caustic as it is, if they don't have another space to be received, another place where they're welcomed, they're just going to stay.
Yeah.
And that extending an invitation of hospitality, as difficult as it is, I think answers the heart level need of belonging and safety that is being answered right now with American Christian nationalism with so many of our loved ones.
Right.
Well, April, thank you so much for your book. I do not want to let this interview go without saying that your book is absolutely hilarious. It's very profound, really good. I highly recommend it. But I have laughed, so, like the way you turned a phrase and the way you set things up. It's a delight to read, and reading about American Christian nationalism is usually a bummer. But your
True.
book, Star Spangled Jesus, is a delight. I love, my favorite chapter of yours is The title is "Store Up Your Treasure Trolls in Heaven," and I just chef's kiss, wonderful. Like the way that you put all that together, and you've got other great lines in the book. So I highly commend your work to anyone who would read it and who wants to know more. I also love your perspective. You're compassionately showcasing what it was like for you, which is going to help us engage people and really humanize the other. And so for your work and for your humor, I say thank you for this book.
Oh, well, thank you so much. And I was reading your book too, and I feel like we have a very similar mindset of like, I feel like I'm a missionary to Christian nationalists
Yeah.
now. And I
Yes.
say that jokingly, but I'm like, but kind of really though. Like
Yeah.
that's where I feel the most called.
Mm.
Not to like over spiritualize it, but it's like, man, we've done so much damage
Yeah.
and it really sucks.
Yes.
But yeah, it's funny too. I was literally just thinking last night of how growing up I was taught I was going to be persecuted for my faith and like, if you were open about following Jesus and like the world's going to hate you
Yeah.
for how you love Jesus, just like they hated Christ.
Mm-hmm.
And the irony is not lost on me that I am very open about my faith and I am
Mm.
most hated by evangelicals.
Yeah. Boy, yes, that's such a good take. I mean, I'm just immediately thinking about the people who were most resistant to Paul
Mm,
and to Jesus were the religious elite, the power brokers. Like the resistance from Rome was kind of secondary,
right.
usually stirred up by the religious power brokers who were leveraging the power of the empire to squash the way of Jesus.
Right.
Yeah.
I know. And Jesus never told his disciples to storm Rome's capital when he was
No.
arrested.
There's that scene where he's standing next to Pilate and, he says this line, like, my kingdom is not of this world. If it was, basically you'd be dead. like, like
Yeah.
I could raise people from the dead. I could, like I could feed 5,000, like he could raise an army. And I think that's so instructive for us as we think about the use of power or our theology and theopraxy of power as it relates to how we approach one another. So, yeah.
Yeah.
And if we get pushback from the religious elite, that seems to be normal too, I'm afraid.
Yeah. It seems to be what happened to Christ. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, April, thank you again for being with us. Where can people find you and your work?
Sure. I am on all the socials. I'm on TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, still on Twitter for now. Blue Sky, I guess,
Yeah,
and
that's a new
Threads,
one.
all the
Uh-huh.
places. Yeah, just April Ajoy, just AJOY. Yeah, and then you can get my book, Star Spangled Jesus, wherever books are sold.
Cool. Thanks for being with us today, April.
Thanks for having me.